And I'm happy to call on Dr. Boardman, expert in mental health policy from England, mental health policy and poverty. Jed, I have to tell you that I'm very happy that you came to Israel and to Jerusalem. Many people in Israel told us that 1 week without stabbing, we will come to Jerusalem. My husband is participating in a conference in his field today, which was supposed to take place in Jerusalem and was moved out of Jerusalem. So thank you for coming, and I suppose that in England you considered a hero for coming to Israel and to Jerusalem in particular. So please share from your experience, and thank you very much.
However, what do I want to talk about today? I want to cover really the area of poverty and what it is, and also think about what I think is the sort of multidimensional nature of poverty. Let's look at why poverty is a bad thing and why perhaps people working and using mental health services should find it relevant and important to them. I also want to look at sort of poverty and social inequalities and health and some of the evidence to examine the link between those things, including mental health, of course, and some of the consequences of poverty. I also sort of just want to mention briefly income inequalities. That's the gap between rich and poor, and the effects, I think, worldwide of the recession that we've had. And finally, try and cover what might be done and what we might be able to do to help people with mental health problems in poverty. Now, I suppose what I might just say before I go any further is that my job actually clinically is in a multidisciplinary team in southeast London. It's traditionally a poor area of London, and it is a very mixed population that lives in that area. There's a high number of people from Africa live there. In fact, I think about 60% of the patients that I see originate either from Africa or from the Caribbean. And it was traditionally a very working class area of London. And I work exclusively with people who suffer from psychoses, so that's people with schizophrenia and bipolar disorders. And in fact, I think, of course, we provide those people with support and treatment, but some of our job is very, very clearly on helping them, if you like, I suppose, keep their heads above water when it comes to things like where they're living, their daily activities, but also the amount of money they have in their pockets. And I know that many of them suffer because, like the woman in the film, once they reach a problem in their lives, perhaps that's because they're not getting enough money or they get excessive expenses, they rapidly go under the poverty line. So let's think about poverty then. I mean, when we think about poverty, many of us, I suppose, see images from low-income countries around the world, famine, people living on the streets, children dying from preventable diseases. And they tell me there's about 1.2 billion people around the world who live in extreme poverty. That's on less than $1 a day. But of course, we know also that poverty exists all around the world. It exists in low and middle income countries and in the most affluent industrial economies. It is a global phenomenon. It can be absolute, but in reality, it exists on a relative scale. And a sociologist, Peter Townsend, who was a leading British academic who influenced a lot on policy and on poverty and social policy, he defined poverty as individuals, families, and groups in the population can be said to be in poverty when they lack resources to obtain the type of diet, participate in the activities, and have the living conditions and amenities which are customary or at least widely encouraged and approved in the societies to which they belong. So in that sense, you can see that poverty can be relative. It can be understood in relationship to the typical living standards in any society. So what Townsend would have said, it would apply here, or in India, or in Germany, or in Great Britain, all around the world. It's really, of course, we know, it's about lack of resources. It's about a lack of adequate financial resources, and that's characteristic of poverty. And of course, it's the consequences of those lack of resources that is important to people. It's also a way of conceptualizing, a way of looking at disadvantage. And traditionally we see poverty and disadvantage in terms of lack of income, hardship, destitution, all of which, in a sense, focus on the idea of material deprivation, of want, and consequent personal distress, i.e. the misery that people experience in poverty. I'm going to talk about what I know about, which is really related to the United Kingdom. But I think it's worth looking at some of the historical changes that have occurred in poverty over the last 100 or so years in the UK, or at least in the 20th century, because that helps us take a longer view of poverty. And I think much of what you'll see in what I say will readily apply to other countries. In fact, I think it's rather important in some ways that if we want to understand the present, we can do this in the light of the past. And also, if we want to look at the future, it's also a helpful guide to us. I'm not original in saying that. I think that comes from John Maynard Keynes, the economist. So, this slide shows two people who were important in measuring poverty and describing poverty in England in the 19th century. That's Charles Booth and Seabohm Rowntree. Rowntree was from the chocolate family, if you recognise the name. What had happened, I think, of course, in the 19th century in England, the growing cities and the industrialisation that had taken place resulted in large numbers of poor people living in, particularly in London, but also in other large towns. But poverty tended to be blamed on the feckless poor. It was their fault for being poor, nobody else's. But it was becoming increasingly obvious to many people that there were growing numbers of people whose poverty you couldn't blame on their individual failings. And actually, of course, it was due to the economic and social circumstances that they lived in. And Charles Booth documented poverty in the East End of London and across London by interviewing people, or had a team to interview people, and define their situations, their poor situations. And those results were published in two books at the end of the 19th century. And he found that 31% of people in London were living in abject poverty. And he defined a poverty line, i.e. below of which you were considered to be poor. And the quote in the slide is his definition. He said, by the word poor, I mean to describe those who have a fairly regular, though bare income, such as 18 shillings to 21 shillings a week. That's about £1 a week, which I guess is about 4 shekels. He defined those as who fall below that standard as very poor, whether because of the chronic irregularity of work or from sickness, or having a large number of children in their families. So he was recognizing that this person's situation made a difference to poverty. Rowntree did similar investigations in a town called York up in the northeast of England. And he found very similar figures. He found 28% of people living in York were in obvious want and squalor. They were poor. Rowntree did something even more important, I think, than Booth. He was more systematic at defining what a level of poverty was. And he defined it, again, around that it was because poverty would occur when the labouring classes, on whom the bulk of muscular work falls, were seriously underfed. So he recognised that actually you had a working population who were underfed. He looked at their diets and so on, and he thought that earning less or having less to live on was a factor in their starvation, if you like, or their underfeeding. And of course he was talking about men who had mainly industrial labouring jobs, who were unfit in a sense for the work that they actually did. He found actually that extreme poverty was experienced in about 18% of people, but there was another group of people who were just above his extreme poverty line that very rapidly went down into poverty if they had any sort of pressure on their expenses and wouldn't be able to feed their families adequately. He also, importantly, described the idea of a life cycle of poverty. And that's, I think, a reflection of the fact that people don't always live in chronic poverty, but they live very near that line of poverty. So at certain times of their life, they'll find life a lot more difficult in terms of their lack of income. And it'll affect people in different ways at different points. So it affects mainly people at the worst as children, because people can't afford to feed their children. It also affects people at later times in their lives when they lose the capacity to work. They may well have better times when their own children start working and start to contribute to the home. But otherwise, their poverty will fluctuate throughout their lives. And I think that remains true in many ways today. Interestingly, Seaborn Rowntree did his first survey at the turn of the 20th century. He also repeated it in 1935 and 1951 and found there was quite a changing picture of poverty in England. When he did it in 1936, which is between the wars, he found that poverty in York had decreased by about 50%. And at that time, though, the driver for poverty was unemployment. His first study found the driver for poverty was lack of decent wages. The third study he did was in 1951, and when we developed a welfare state, and he found that absolute poverty was very uncommon in York, but still remained a problem for the elderly. And that was partly, he put that down to the sort of welfare state developments after the war, but the fact that pensions were still not adequate. The other thing that these early studies did was they showed that the burden of poverty often fell on women. That was a book published in 1912 which looked at women in an area of London called Lambeth. It's actually just adjacent, very near to where I work, and still remains a poor area. And a set of women went and interviewed women of working class families to look at the struggle they had to keep the money in the household and keep their children fed and clothed. And it was at that time, I mean, we talk about the feminization of poverty now, but in force, poverty has always been feminized. It's always been an aspect that the women take the main burden of. It's a lovely book, actually, that. It's still very readable nowadays. I read it earlier this year. So, I mean, what you found there is that those early pioneers gave us a systematic study of poverty and its effects on other human beings. Of course, in the rest of the 20th century in the UK, in England, the picture of poverty changed. You know, by the 1950s and 60s, the largest group of people in poverty were the elderly. But by the 60s, public attention was again drawn to the fact that many children lived in poverty. Pensioner poverty, poverty in the elderly, did actually decline in the 1970s because of improvements in retirement pensions. But at that time, a lot of people with disabilities were seen to be living in poverty, physical disabilities. And of course, for physical disabilities, also read people with mental health problems, because the two tend to go together in terms of their lack of money. In the 1980s, things changed enormously, and we found that there was an even greater rise in poverty after 1978. And at that time, a particular culprit was unemployment, and also many people who were lone parents, mainly women, were at risk of poverty. Now, what we do in the UK is we define poverty as a household income that's less than about 60% of the median income for the country. And the median income, the average sort of income in the UK, is about £24,000. So it's a person who lives on a wage or an income in that family of around £10,000. So and for England, I tell you, that's low. And when we measured, if you look at that, it shows the rise in poverty over the 1980s. You know, in 1979, there were about 7 million poor people in the whole of Great Britain. By 1997, it had risen to about 14 million. And despite some annual variations, remains at that figure now. So about 13 million people are currently in poverty, and 3.7 million of those people are children. The population of Great Britain is just over 60,000. Population of England's about 50,000. Also, as I said, people move in and out of poverty, but about 8% of the population live in persistent poverty. That's poverty that lasts for sort of at least 3 years out of any 4. And I think you'll find that's sort of common across the world as well. The other thing to remember, being poor in the past increases your likelihood of being poor in the future. So many of those people living in persistent poverty will remain like that for many years. Pensioner and child poverty has fallen over the years, but never to the degree that the government really wanted it. So that gives you an idea of sort of what's happening in the UK. Remember, the UK is an affluent country, and but we still experience many aspects of poverty. Now, I think you can't treat poverty on its own. It can't be just regarded as a single phenomena. It's multidimensional, if you like. It covers an inability to satisfy people's basic needs, lack of control over their resources, lack of education, lack of work, isolation, poor health. All of those things tend to go together. And of course, what poverty means to people will vary across the world, across nations. Definitions of poverty and its causes will vary depending on people's gender, their age, their culture, and the sort of other social and economic context. I think that has, in a way, two implications for the talk I'm giving today. One is that when you look at considerations of linking poverty to mental ill health, it's no use just looking at the amount of income. You have to look at a range, if you like, of social and economic variables that measure not just income, but are indicators of the deprivation and disadvantage that people experience. In other words, you've really got to be looking at inequalities in these variables and in health status across nations, if you want to understand it properly. I also think it's helpful to have some sort of shorthand way of summarizing disadvantage that might capture this sort of multidimensional nature of poverty and will allow us to illustrate clearly any of the disadvantages that groups of people experience, including, of course, people with mental health problems. The term I quite like using, and I find very helpful, is social exclusion. Now, what do I mean by social exclusion? Well, there's three sort of comments there on the slide about social exclusion. The first one comes from a UK government body that now doesn't exist but was created in the 1990s, the Social Exclusion Unit. It was part of the Prime Minister's office, then became part of the Deputy Prime Minister's office. It was highly regarded as an important unit. And they described social exclusion as a shorthand term for what can happen when people or areas of a country suffer from a combination of linked problems such as unemployment, poor skills, low income, poor housing, high crime environments, bad health and family breakdown. They also went on to say the most important characteristic of social exclusion is that these problems are linked and mutually reinforcing, and they can combine to create a fast and vicious moving circle. And I think that's typical of what you see in these areas. You know, one thing leads to another, if you like, and people often go downhill in terms of their income and their lifestyles very quickly. The other thing that a useful definition, I think, of social exclusion, which encapsulates it, is that a person is socially excluded if he or she doesn't participate in key activities of the society to which he or she lives. So it's a reflection, that, I think, of the consequences for many people of living in excluded situations, living in situations of poverty and need. Is that they don't participate in the same ways. And I think many people with mental health problems will, of course, recognize that. And many people who work with people with mental health problems will also understand that. I got some colleagues together some years ago who were experts in mental health and also people who worked in the field of poverty and social exclusion. And we did this through the Royal College of Psychiatrists. We had a special scoping group, and we came out, at the end, we had so much information, we came out with a book. But in that, we used some of the domains we saw, the dimensions of participation, which actually concern things like being excluded from material resources, i.e. people are poor, they haven't got the power to purchase goods and services. They are income poor. Also, another dimension would be production. That's exclusion from, if you like, socially valued productive activity. You know, that's being unemployed, having no work, or being poorly educated. Another area would be in social interaction. You know, you're excluded from social relations and neighborhoods. So it's interaction with family and friends and community. Your networks are isolated. Also, political engagement. So it's really sort of exclusion from civic participation, you know, involvement in local or national decision-making, such as having a voice, having a sense of choice and control. And finally, there's sort of exclusion from health and social and health service engagement. You know, having good health, having the ability or inability to access appropriate services. Now, having gone through that list, in each of those areas, you'll find people with mental health problems are excluded in some way from society. Not in every dimension, but in many of those. And I think that's sort of one of the things I sort of want to argue today. But let's just think, why is poverty bad? What is it about poverty that's bad for individuals and bad for society? Well, for individuals, it's certainly bad for health and well-being. It's a cause of infant mortality, it's a cause of premature death, it's associated with a higher occurrence of disease, including mental health problems. And it's detrimental, of course, to people's well-being and their quality of life. It's bad for people's day-to-day lives. You know, it's associated with hunger, lack of employment, poor housing, poor education, poor neighborhoods, violence, crime. It's bad for people's life chances and limits people's potential. You know, being born into poverty has effects on people's later development, their later experiences, and their outcomes in life. And it's bad for families. Its negative effects can be passed from one generation to another. It's bad for society because it restricts the value of human capital and the contribution of a significant section of the population to the economic and social life of that nation. It's also, of course, linked to crime, social unrest, unemployment, which are themselves costly to a nation. Now, that's a sort of quick overview of damaging effects of poverty, but it does emphasize the damaging effects of poverty worldwide, and it also points to the damaging effects for people who have mental health problems. Now, why do I think social exclusion, this concept, is actually so important to think about when we're thinking about people with mental health problems? Indeed, I think, you could cover any health problems with what I'm going to say. Well, firstly, it's a relative concept, as I've said, and it can be applied anywhere. Secondly, it can apply to a range of specific groups, people with mental health problems, people with disabilities generally. But also, you can see within that, there might be people who particularly suffer. And I'm thinking here of perhaps people, thinking of people like women. I'm thinking of the people who are homeless, people who end up in prison. I'm thinking of people who are refugees and asylum seekers. All those people are excluded in some way, and some absolutely. If you're in prison, you're definitely excluded from participation. But if you're homeless, as Waldo said, you're also excluded in that way. It's helpful because, of course, it's based on the same ideas of poverty and deprivation. It's the same. We're talking about the same thing. It also emphasizes, I think, this notion of agency and the processes that are involved. It corresponds quite well to a sort of social model of disability, which, as we know, stresses the role of social and environmental barriers in producing disability. It's helpful in that way to sort of look at it as part of the social barriers that people with mental health problems and other disabilities face in society. It's got lots of dynamic dimensions as well. Often what you're seeing is a sort of cycles of poverty. It's got a negative feedback loop, if you like. You can descend from one level of poverty into another, or from not being poor into poverty easily by social factors that affect you. It's also got this notion of participation, which I think is really important. It's intuitive, that, to people. People want to participate in society. And it's recognized by many people. Each of those dimensions I mentioned earlier are ways of measuring people's exclusion. And so they do form a way of sort of measuring changes in society. We can also look at the sort of life course and longitudinal aspects of this, because poverty is something that in early life affects people in later life. And we could see even from Roundtree's sort of lifespan of poverty that these things change over time. And it tells us perhaps how we can prevent some of the damaging effects of poverty, but also how interventions at various points in time can help people out of poverty. It also sort of brings up things like choice and access, both of which I think have been important politically to many disabled people, and certainly are important to people with mental health problems. Choice, I think, is about, if you like, power to make decisions. And it's a key part of the sort of self-agency that we experience. And it's also part, of course, of political engagement. You can also see it in a more consumerist way, i.e., actually having a decent choice about the services that you use and access. In that way, choice is a means to an end. but also choice in itself, because we're looking at people's life choices and engagement and being treated with dignity and respect, are actually ends in themselves. You don't even have to argue the effects on health. You know that being excluded in itself is a situation you must change. So it also brings up stigma and discrimination. What you're interested in here is not so much the locating the factors of stigma within people, but within society. We're talking really about ignorance, we're talking about prejudice, and we're talking about discrimination, all of which I know are important components in those social barriers to people with mental health problems. It also brings up the notions of equality and human rights. You know, equality is itself important in its own right and places a value on people getting the same or being treated the same in many respects. And of course, a human rights approach says there's only one thing that matters in your entitlement to rights, and that's one's humanity. And both those concepts of equality and human rights fit in well into the scope of social exclusion and are going to be important principles in helping people with mental health problems. The other one is citizenship. You know, people with mental health problems should be seen in having the same rights of active citizenship as anybody else in society. And that fits with our social disability model, it fits with a rights approach and becomes very important, I think, in the way we think of people with mental health problems. It also fixes, I think, responsibility of governments to respond to the legitimate demands for sort of parity, for equality, and to respond to those demands by committing resources to people with mental health problems and other disabilities. Next to the last is social capital. I think I didn't want to talk too much about social capital. I still find it a very complex area, but it's really a way of describing linkages between, you know, psychological and structural in society that allow things to work for the common good. And social inclusion and social capital both depend, in a sense, on participation in social networks. And it's those, actually, that are a good measure of people's exclusion, i.e. lack of participation in social networks. But, of course, they're an important part of improving the quality of people's lives. Being actually participant in one's social networks is a way of deriving support and help for people. It's also a way of increasing people's self-respect and self-worth. Finally, I wanted to bring up an area of recovery. I was told you're sick of hearing about recovery, but I don't care if you're sick about it. I'm still going to repeat it again, because there is an aspect of recovery that fits very well with social exclusion. You know, the ideas of hope, of agency and opportunity, choice, I think was the word that Waldo used, are very important in the areas of recovery. But those do overlap with many aspects of social inclusion. I think there's a sort of, if you like, creative synthesis between these two concepts, recovery and social inclusion. You know, recovery both requires and allows social inclusion, and social inclusion helps to promote people's recovery. You know, they're key concepts, I think, that we can't ignore, and we can't ignore for people with mental health problems. You know, and if we were to have improved recovery-orientated practice within our services, that in itself would promote social inclusion for people and challenge things like marginalisation of people and stigmatising views and behaviours, even in our own services. Because I think one of the important areas to look at for stigma is within health services, as well as in wider society. And we also want people to participate in wider society. You know, participate in studying, working, participating in leisure activities in mainstream setting, having good family relationships, living independently, having control of one's own self-care and medication and money, having a social life, taking part in a local community, and feeling a satisfaction with life. Those are all important outcomes for people with mental health problems. They're also, if you think about it, socially inclusive outcomes. So I think if we promote social inclusion, we will also be promoting opportunities for service users to achieve their full potential as they recover. And in doing so, I think our services will be embracing some of the core components of the recovery-orientated practice. So, what about taking this a bit farther? What about the sort of evidence for health and social exclusion? Health and social inequalities, health and poverty. Let's look at some of these. I'm again using some of the UK experiences, but up on the slide there, you'll see 4 reports. They were all reports, 3 of them from the UK, 1 from the WHO. They were all reports on social inequalities in health. They all showed that people at the bottom of our society have much worse health, more ill health, than people at higher advantage groups in society. And we see a definite gap between the people at the top and at the bottom when it comes to their health. The first report was written in 1980, and it was called the Black Report. It was the black not because it was a dark report, but because the man who chaired the committee that wrote it, Sir Douglas Black, that was his name, and he was a well-known physician and epidemiologist. And what that found back in 1980 was the extent of ill health and death were unequally distributed across the population of Britain, and suggested also that those health inequalities were widening. It concluded that those inequalities were not due to failings in the NHS, the National Health Service, but rather to many other social equalities influencing health: income, education, housing, diet, employment, conditions of work. It's not very different for those things that we were recognising at the end of the 19th century. And the report recommended quite a wide strategy of social policy measures to combat those inequalities. Interestingly, that report originally never really saw the light of day. The government virtually disowned it. They published very few copies of it at the time, and very few people had an opportunity to read it. And I think that should remind us, actually, that as a man called Rudolf Virchow said, medicine's a social science, and politics is nothing else but medicine on a large scale. And it illustrates, I think, the clear overlap between politics and medicine, but it also illustrates the sensitivity of governments that health is a political and economic matter. And certainly, study of health inequalities does tell us that. The subsequent report, the second one in that on the slide, was done by Donald Aitchison, another who was chief medical officer at the time. It showed exactly the same things. Fortunately, this did have some influence on government. But we still had to produce another report saying the same thing, Marmot Review, in 2010. And again, that showed, large health inequalities existing in the UK. The WHO also showed exactly the same thing in their Closing the Gap report. So it's a problem that exists around the world. And all those reports point to large changes in people's health as you look across the sort of gradient, the socioeconomic gradient that exists in society between people at the top and people at the bottom. And the gaps, actually, in that gradient for health are extremely large. For example, if I was to walk across a borough in London, let's say Westminster in central London, that's where Parliament is. There's an 18-year gap in male life expectancy between the least and most affluent parts of that area of London. In other words, men in the lowest socioeconomic groups die 18 years earlier on average than people at the top. In Glasgow, in Scotland, that gap is 28 years if you look across that city. In Baltimore in the USA, it's 20 years. Now remember, the gap between the USA in life expectancy and India is 20 years as well. So the gaps across rich and poor nations also exist within nations, and it's attributed by the socioeconomic inequalities. So do we find the same for people with mental health problems? Well, in general, we do. Those slides show some figures from the national morbidity surveys conducted in England, and you'll see on the left-hand side the figures for income groups and prevalence of schizophrenia. And the two large bars on that graph are people in the lowest income groups. And you'll see that they have by far the largest prevalence of schizophrenia compared to the higher income groups. And that's a finding found in many countries. With people with long-term severe psychoses, you generally find a big gap between low income groups and high income groups. You will find very similar findings for people, if you like, with common mental disorders. I mean people with depression and anxiety, the commonest disorders in the population. Those findings tend to be less startling than in schizophrenia, but you still see a gap between people with low incomes and people with high incomes. Now, I probably want to highlight people with severe and long-term disorders because they're generally the poorest groups of people with mental health problems in nations. In England, most people who have schizophrenia will be out of work and they will be on state benefits. If they're given proper state benefits, they can just about manage on that. Remember, the highest bit of your income goes into your rent in general. And most people with schizophrenia live in rented accommodation in England. So if you can cover that for people, plus give them money that covers their loss of earnings and money that covers their additional costs of their disabilities, they can just about live over the poverty line. And often people with those mental health problems don't apply for the adequate benefits. But you do find if you have welfare benefit officers associated with your mental health teams, that they can have a significant effect on making sure that those people have adequate benefits to cover their living costs. Without that, they tend to get really very anxious because they know that if they're not getting the adequate money, they rapidly fall into debt and other things. And there's some evidence, I think, that those stresses on people, particularly with schizophrenia, are a cause of relapse. And of course but then the burden of the economy falls on health services who then have to deal with the subsequent admission to hospital. So, we find this not only in Europe but around the world. It doesn't matter where, and you'll also find that different ways of measuring this, whether you measure it through unemployment, housing, material standards of living, or whatever, come out with roughly the same answers. So it's those areas of socioeconomic deprivation that really are mattering here. If you were to look in... Oh, thank you. Thank you. He's anticipating I'm getting thirsty. Thank you. My needs are being met up here, which is wonderful. I mean, if you look on longitudinal studies, you'll find that people's, say, depressive symptoms will also vary according to their standards of living. Lowering your material standards of living increases people's depressive symptoms, and also tends to sort of put them in a position where they go from being, reasonably well to being a case of depression. So, you've also got to remember that many of these people, particularly people with psychoses, are not always presenting to mental health services. Many people who are poor, when they do present to mental health services, don't want to engage in psychological therapies, or they start therapy and rapidly drop out of it. And they generally have poorer outcomes when it comes to psychological therapies as well. Now, the same, I'm afraid, applies to children. If you look at children in some of the national morbidity surveys in Great Britain, you'll find that they also show the same gradient between rich and poor families. Poor families having larger amounts of childhood psychiatric disorders than rich families. In fact, it's around 3 times higher in the children of the lowest income groups compared to the highest income groups. And also, it's the same in families who are receiving state benefits. They are 2 to 3 times as likely to have children who experience mental health problems. Remember also that many of those parents of those children have a background of adversity themselves, which will be reflected in subsequent and previous generations, this sort of cycle of deprivation that occurs. It's a sort of concept of a self-perpetuating cultural group which is defined by poverty and relationship difficulties. And of course, I think that's very familiar to people working in the child and adolescent field, and very clear to people working in adult psychiatry. I just also want to remind you that, of course, what it often means, being poor, is a lack of basic necessities. We've seen that from our 2 videos. And those basic necessities are, in the UK, things simply food, fresh fruit and vegetables, clothes, having money to spend on yourself rather than just existing, home insurance, living in a damp-free house, and having any regular savings. Many of those people with schizophrenia have no savings whatsoever. They've got resources coming in, but no assets. So, what about other areas that people with mental health problems experience difficulties with that are associated with low income? Well, debt is one of them. Debt is a particular experience for people with mental ill health. They're 3 times as likely to be in debt and twice as likely to have problems managing their money compared with the general population. What often happens to people is they get into what's called people refer as a debt spiral. Whether, if you like, you're in debt, you have missed payments, there are penalties for those missed payments, you attempt to juggle your personal finances or borrow additional money. That increases then the pressure from your creditors. You then start to make unrealistic arrangements to pay off those debts. You get threatened with legal proceedings. You get an entrenchment of your problems. They get worse, leading, of course, to an eventual loss of important resources. And one of those important resources is your accommodation. Losing that, you become homeless, which is another nail in the coffin of your exclusion. Remember also, people live poor people generally live in poor neighborhoods. And our surveys generally, of national surveys, generally show that. And people with psychoses are more likely to live in poor neighborhoods. there's a relationship between suicide and common mental disorders. Of course, in those areas, people experience inequalities, rates of criminal victimization are higher, more crime, and people become both victim and perpetrator in those circumstances. Housing, often people with mental health problems live in poor housing. Most people now with severe mental health problems in the UK live in independent housing. They're not in supported housing, and many people don't live with their families, they live on their own. Transport becomes a problem. You can't afford money for transport. You can't often get to the places you want for your treatment, but also for your sort of general social life, and your social networks are impeded by that. Education, we know there's a clear link between lack of education and mental health problems, not least because many mental health problems start in late teens and early adulthood, and people don't finish their education properly. And that's shown to be a high risk in many countries. And often that low educational attainment that you have as a young person is actually difficult to make up with in later life. Employment, well, we know that people with schizophrenia, with a diagnosis of schizophrenia, have low employment rates generally in most industrial societies. Probably around 10% will be in some form of open employment. It's similar in people with common mental health problems, and in fact, they're less likely to be employed than the general population, but they have much higher employment rates than people with schizophrenia. Maybe 40–50% of people are employed who have common mental health problems. Social networks are poor for people and are associated with poverty. People with severe mental health problems are 5 times more likely to report than the general population some severe lack of support in their lives, and they're often isolated. And many, of course, derive most of their social contacts from either other service users or health and social service personnel. Personal safety is a big problem for people with mental health problems. Now, we're often used to the literature focusing on violence perpetrated by people with mental health problems. But of course, they're much more likely to be victims of violence or other crime than members of the general population. And members of the general population are also likely to be more violent and murder people than people with mental health problems. About half of people treated in a community mental health team like myself in London described experiences of verbal and physical abuse. And physical abuse particularly was commonly experienced by people with psychoses and other disorders. And in fact, of course, people with learning difficulties also experience very similar acts of abuse on themselves. Political engagement, there's very little actually good quality work on political engagement. Involvement in civic society. But I think we can assume that many of these things shown in that slide, which include voting in elections, being members of clubs, trade unions, writing and asking for help from your local politicians, are actually much less likely to happen in people with mental health problems. The final thing on that slide is physical health inequalities. People with all forms of mental health problems are at risk of premature death, both from natural and unnatural causes, i.e. suicide and other causes of death. And there are a range of other physical health inequalities seen in people with mental health problems. For example, people with a diagnosis of schizophrenia or bipolar disorder or depression die younger than other people, but they've significantly higher rates of obesity, smoking, heart disease, hypertension, respiratory disease, diabetes and stroke, and breast cancer as well, than other citizens. So there is something about having, if you like, a severe mental health problem that puts you in a sort of double jeopardy. You've got your mental health problem and you're more likely to experience physical ill health and possibly less access to health services. You also see the more complex a person's mental health problems, because of course we know that these sort of problems come in battalions rather than in single entities. They're often mixed up, aren't they? Where people will experience maybe a psychosis alongside substance abuse problems, maybe have some learning disability or one of the other neurodevelopmental disorders such as Asperger's. And the more complex mental health problems actually also are more likely to live chaotic lives and to be socially excluded. So, what can we say about this then? We can say that people who are in contact with mental health services, people who experience poor mental health in the community, are likely to be excluded, and the more severe mental health people with severe mental health problems are more likely to be excluded than people with other forms of mental health problems. The more complex the illness, the worse it is for people. Now, this multiple exclusion that people experience with mental health problems has economic consequences. But it's a concern, of course, for more than economic reasons. There's strong evidence that health outcomes are influenced by disadvantage. You know, unemployment's bad for your health. There's also evidence that people, the great majority of people, in fact, that use secondary mental health services aspire to living more fulfilling lives, you know, including entering paid employment. But the barriers to their ambitions are, of course, significant. You know, they've got active symptoms maybe, they've got cognitive impairment, they've got episodic and fluctuating symptoms. Their conditions wax and wane, they get worse, they get better at times. Now, all those things are hard, but they're not insuperable challenges to individuals and the clinician. You know, good clinical outcomes are important, although sometimes difficult to achieve. But perhaps even more difficult is the outcome related to social barriers. You know, low expectations by clinicians, low expectations by people's families. You know, the effects of treatment, stigma and discrimination, and probably disincentives in our welfare system that put people's basic incomes at risk. Now, we said there are sort of direct consequences of this. You know, poverty has serious implications for people's health, and poverty and unemployment themselves are damaging. But of course, poverty can mediate the impacts of mental health problems. For example, social relations are made difficult by already made difficult by reduced interpersonal functioning that people experience, may be made worse by and strained by poverty. You know, the negative connotations of poverty and welfare may exacerbate the stigma that people experience. You know, there is a stigma against the poor and disadvantaged in society. So there are people who have mental health problems and are poor also have a sort of, if you like, a double stigma. And I think you can see that from many studies that have been done on the experience both of people without mental health problems who use welfare services and people with mental health problems who use them as well. Now, what about sort of people's experiences of poverty? Well, I mean, we've heard from two individuals now about their experiences of poverty. I can quote you many other that give a sort of similar picture. But let's just look at some examples from Sweden and from Scotland. Those in that slide are from Sweden. I'm not going to read them all, but let's just take a couple of them. You know, a week before you get your money, you're usually broke. But it's hard because then you have to borrow money from a friend. This weekend, I'm going home to my mum and dad so I can have my meals there. Another one said, I'm so ashamed that I haven't succeeded better in life. It feels like I'm just going round in circles. I think that's what makes me tired, like I can never get ahead no matter what I do. I feel myself a patient first and foremost. It's got the upper hand instead of my having a profession like. Another one said, I've got only 2 front teeth left and they're getting rotten. I want a set of false teeth. I can't put up with this anymore. They've all got to go. I had a tooth infection, and within 3 weeks, half of my teeth were gone. Medication also affects your teeth. He couldn't afford to go to the dentist. If we look at some of the folks in Scotland, there's a debt advisor in Scotland said about the people he was seeing. I see a lot of people who have bipolar disorder and have accumulated debts whilst in their manic phases, or people who suffer a setback like a partner dying, which impacts on mental health. And this spiralling mental ill health can lead to not bothering about financial payments and debts accumulating. Another one said, out of my benefits at the moment, I must be spending 20 to 25 pounds a week on getting around. I guess that's about 80 to 100 shekels. And that's just on public transport. Tomorrow I have to get to hospital, so that's 2 trains. That's got to come out of my benefit. Some of the costs are down to me as I'm trying to get out there and attend classes and do things, but I won't get a bus pass. Bus passes are often given as a way of getting free transport in the UK. Indeed, I get a bus pass because I'm now 60, but I ought to give that to some of my patients, I think. So, what this suggests to us is that we can't ignore, in a sense, the social and economic context that people with mental health problems live in, and of course what many health professionals work in. You know, poverty and social inclusion are causes and consequences of mental health problems, and they modulate, I think, the relationship between mental health problems and the outcomes that people experience, such as having poor networks. You know, those quotes show how people with severe mental illness are affected by and have dealt with their financial situation. And it underlines, I think, the importance of widening the focus of what mental health services do to include people's social context in assessments and in our knowledge base. You know, changing our perspective would mean viewing some of those difficulties that people experience in the community as no longer as individual symptoms of their disorder and their own failures, but as a consequence of the actual circumstances in which those people live. You know, consequently, the difficulties that they often experience shouldn't be assumed to be symptoms of mental disorder, but require other approaches to explain them. Now, I'll just say I've kind of focused on the negative effects of poverty and the vulnerability of people with mental health problems. But we shouldn't forget that people have strengths as well, you know, and find often ways of managing their own difficult situations, sometimes with from help from significant others and sometimes not. That notion of resilience that comes from strength is not really just a matter of, if you like, extraordinary experiences by remarkable individuals, but it's part of managing life for many people with mental health problems. And such that the relatively small steps people take towards living an ordinary life can themselves be regarded as resilient outcomes. And resilience can be seen as a sort of more common phenomena. And I think we recognise that in rehabilitation. It's about taking small steps for people. Just to sort of illustrate that by a story on a short piece about Nina. Nina was a woman living in a deprived community in England, and it was described by a community project worker, Anne. Anne said the success for Nina, she suffered herself very much with depression, so it was very much about getting herself out of bed, getting the kids to school, the house clean and the meals cooked. But it's taken 4 years to improve that. Her actual confidence has come on leaps and bounds, and she's now a member of the residents group. So faced with depression, the small positive steps that Nina took were actually highly significant for her life and helpful in her own recovery. And of course, we shouldn't forget that the harm caused by poverty to children's development seems to be growing in the long term. That if you look at, the probability of multiple deprivations for people who've been born in poverty, they are much more likely to occur in people born in poverty or from low-income groups than they are in higher-income groups. So the start of your life does matter. It also matters probably to your people's cognitive development, in the sense that if you get a bad start in life, the likelihood of you improving your cognitive development as time goes on is much lower than if you have a good start in life. So there's a definite link between poverty, social disadvantage, and the sort of child development and the subsequent getting disorders. I just want to finish shortly, but I want to remind you about two other things. One is there's not only a link between mental health problems and poverty, there's also a link within countries between income inequality and mental health problems. And that's shown in that graph there. In other words, countries which have high differences, high inequality between people who earn lots of money and people who earn only a little bit of money, are more likely to have higher levels of mental health problems. So the United States, which is on the top of that slide, has probably some of the highest income inequality in the world, also has the highest number of mental health problems. Japan, which has a much lower income inequality, also has much lower levels of mental health problems. And there's another study that's been recently done in Sweden. And this was a study of a group of 100 people who were in contact with mental health services, but bulk of which had a diagnosis of schizophrenia. And that group were given additional supplements of money on top of their ordinary welfare payments. And they compared that group to another group of similar people who weren't given that extra money. And what they found was that that group of people who were given the extra money, after 6 months, showed a drop in their experienced symptoms. They showed an increase in their subjective quality of life, their sense of self, but also an increase in their social networks. And in fact, when they look more closely at that group, several of the people in it said they'd intensified relationships that they'd already acquired. Others resumed earlier social relationships. The common ground for this was the fact that their improved economic status had enabled them to get out more, if you like, and improve the mutuality of their relationship with other people. They had something to offer that other people. So when they were getting invited home for coffee or out for a drink or whatever, they could also return that favour to the others before they felt unable to do that. So there is some evidence that improving people's amount of money that you're given actually does things that we do sometimes say are the handicaps for people with schizophrenia, i.e., low social networks, of course, are a symptom of schizophrenia. But are they? If you give people more money, they improve it. Okay, so I'm going to finish now. I'm going to remind you, though, that there are many other ways that our services and can improve through improving people's housing, through in people's so it's improving people's employment rates, improving people's social networks, and they're all part of what psychosocial rehabilitation can do. Now, in the UK, I think we have made some steps, but it's been very slow, and I want to warn you that steps must be made at a government level to improve people's outcomes. But we should base what we're doing in our service on a set of important principles, things like autonomy, accessibility, continuity, comprehensiveness, co-production, empowerment, and so on. I also want to leave you with the thought about the unpleasantness, I think, of poverty and discrimination. Poverty and inequality are bad for us, but it's not inevitable. And Michael Marmot, in his book, I think, makes the point that, poverty is bad for health, and in the world we live in, health is stratified. Better off people have better health than poorer people. Disadvantaged have the poorest health. And he also points out, if there was a situation where we found a chemical in the water or in food that was damaging to children's growth and their brains worldwide, and thus their intellectual development and control of emotions, just like inequality, we clamour for an immediate action. We don't, though, of course. He also points out that that pollutant is actually called social disadvantage. Sorry, I've gone over it again. Let's go right to the end. I like the red colour of this man's book, actually, if nothing else. There we go. It's called Social Disadvantage, and it's got profound effects on developing brains and limits children's intellectual and social development. Note the pollutant is not only poverty, but also social disadvantage. There's a clear social gradient in intellectual, social, and emotional development. The higher the social position of families, the more do children flourish, and the better they score on all developmental measures. This stratification in early childhood arises from inequality in social circumstances. So I hope I've at least persuaded you today that poverty is bad for people. It's a cause of mental health problems. It's also a result of mental health problems. But more than that, it's passed on to subsequent generations. It does affect the capacity of people to succeed in society. And we all know that a group of people who are limited in their success in society are those with mental health problems. And I, like many others in this room, I think we need to change that. So thank you for listening.